Good afternoon. It's always such a pleasure to learn together here at Risha. This is Fallsman, and the class's discussions on the Parashah with Rabbi Silber this week. Just a couple words. I'll be sending everyone an invitation to become a panelist. That would allow you to show us your smiling face if you wish. Of course, you don't have to. More importantly, it would allow you to unmute yourself when Rabbi Silber welcomes questions. Please stay muted when you're not actively speaking. I'll help mute you just so we can avoid having background noise. But of course, feel free to unmute whenever you're ready to speak. You can also engage, ask questions, make comments on the chat here on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Silber.
Okay. All right. This week's parasha is Parashas Noach. We went towards the beginning of Sefer Bereishit, so I pick out one section of the parasha and discuss that. Happy to respond to any comments or questions about Noach in the course of this hour. But the story I wanted to begin with is after Noach emerges from the ark, which is in chapter 9, beginning in verse, 18. That section begins in verse 18. So the Torah tells us that when Noach emerges from the ark, he emerges with his three sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafet. And then the Torah added, and the Cham is the father of Canaan. That statement, of course, suggests to the reader, and we know this is the case, that somehow Canaan will figure in the next story. Next story will focuses on all his children, all his sons, but in particular, Cham and Canaan will come into play in these few verses towards the end of chapter 9. Shlosha Ela b'nei Noach u'me'ela naftzah kol haaretz, says the Torah. These are the sons of Noach. From these three, the world branched out. So what we have over here is one might say, a recreation of the world. The world is destroyed through the Mabul, which is the first part of the parasha. But Noach is the one person, together with his family, whom God singles out, instructed to build an ark and to bring, one might say, samples of all the living creatures together with Noach, with him in the ark. And when he emerges from the ark, he's been commanded to, one might say, recreate the world. The commands earlier in chapter 9, he's told, Vayomer, beginning the first verse of chapter 9, Pru revu u'mi'u et haaretz. He's told to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth. One might say, to recreate the earth. Later on, in verse number 7, after he's been given certain instruction, V'yatem pru revu shirtu ba'aretz u'revu ba, increase, abound on the earth, increase in the earth. So what we have over here in the story of Noach, one might say, is a recreation of the world. The world is destroyed. That world is described in the first few chapters of Bereishit, the two creation narratives. That world is gone. Chapter 1 describes the creation of everything, heaven and earth. But now that world is gone. But now Noach is the person through whom God will recreate the world. It's interesting to think about this. Of course, it lends itself to more than one interpretation. One is that we have a totally new world. It is a new world, and it's different in many respects. But the other way to see Noach is not just that he's a new creation, but in some sense, he's the link to the previous creation. So the world is destroyed, but not 100% destroyed. There's a remnant. There's a rishuma. There's a remnant of that earlier world, and that's Noach. So Noach is, one might say, the link between the old world, but certainly the world that Noach will inhabit is a different world. It's different in a couple of senses. It's different because certain things are permitted in this new world that were not permitted in the old world. For example, the eating of meat, which is clearly permitted in the beginning of chapter 9, but clearly was not permitted when God speaks to Adam in the first chapter and permits Adam to eat of the vegetation and the fruit, and the animals may eat of the vegetation, but there's certainly no sense that one can eat the animals. That's new over here. This bespeaks a whole different relationship of Noah to the world. Here the Torah speaks about the dread and fear of the human shall be upon the animals, and there's all kinds of permissibilities given. So it's a new world in that sense, but it's also a new world in another sense. Maybe it's related, and that is that in this new world, in the beginning of chapter 9, Noah is given instruction about the world, and among other things that he's told is the verse Shofech dam ha'adam va'adam damo yishafech. Usually translated as whoever sheds the blood of the human, by the human shall his blood be shed. Ki b'tzelem Elohim asa ha'adam, for God created the human in God's image. So what that seems to be saying is that Noah is being commanded, is being told that from this point on, he will be responsible for the world. The Talmud, of course, takes this verse and one might say broadens the sense of responsibility. The Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin speaks about Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments, a couple of which are very broad. For example, dinim, laws, rules or laws, which is understood variously, but according to the Ramban, for example, it means a legal system. So God says to Noah, in this new world, you have more rights, in a certain sense, dominion over the earth. You can even kill the animals and eat them, but you also have responsibilities to govern fairly. And that is, Ki b'tzelem Elohim asa ha'adam, because God has created the human being in God's image. It's not altogether clear whether that statement, for God has created the human in God's image, is the reason why the shedder of blood is to be penalized. Is that what it means? That since people are created in God's image, so you are responsible if you injure them, you kill them or whatever? That's one possibility. But the other possibility is that Ki b'tzelem Elohim asa ha'adam refers not to the victim, but to the judge. The reason I instruct you to judge and to govern the world fairly is because the human being is created, because you are created in God's image. And as such, whereas previously God was the sole arbiter and the sole judge, from this point on, the human being plays that role, a role of judge. So these are two different ways to read the verse, but the point is that at the beginning of chapter 9, we have a description of, one might say, a new world. In fact, in the Talmud speaks of the human beings today, all human beings, as B'nai Noach. They're not really called B'nai Adam, typically. They're called B'nai Noach. So what we have over here in chapter 9, Noach is emerging from the ark into a different kind of world. Okay, that's the beginning of chapter 9. I'm not going to get into the details of this Noachide commandments, but it's the general rule. The ones that's explicit is the taking of life, and the Talmud broadened that, expanded that to include other things as well. It speaks of Sheva Mitzvot. Fine. And now we have a story beginning in verse number 19. So Noach and his children emerged from the ark, and now we have the following story. I'll read a bit, and I'll stop and take comments or questions in a minute. It says, Vayachel Noach ish adama, vayita karem. So Noach, Vayachel, literally became, here the translation I was the first to plant a vineyard. Vayitgal b'toch ha'alo, he uncovered himself within his tent. Whether he uncovered himself purposely or whether he became uncovered, given the fact that he was drunk. He drank from the wine, he became drunk. And as a person who is drunk is not fully aware of what he is doing, so he finds himself drunk, says the Torah, but also uncovered in his tent. And now we have the following curious story. It says, Vayar Cham avi Canaan eiter vat achiv, vayaged l'shnei echav bachutz. So Cham, here the Torah once again says the father of Canaan, he literally saw his father. Vayar Cham, he saw his father's nakedness, and he told his 2 brothers. So the first question when you read the story is, what does it mean he saw his father's nakedness? Does it mean what it says? He saw his uncovered father. And instead of trying to cover him up, he tells his brothers. That's one possibility. But we have to remember that in the Torah, the expression Lirot Erva is one that appears in the 2 chapters in the book of Vayikra that talk about forbidden relationships. And then it talks about Arayot as Lirot Erva. It's a euphemism to see with the nakedness. So over here, it's a question, did he simply see? Or did he actually do something? And if he did something, what did he do? The reason that one might favor the opinion that not only did he see, but he actually did something. There are a number of possibilities what he did, all of which are negative, obviously. Because when it says that Noah wakes up, which is found in verse number 24, Vayiketz Noach miyeno vayeda et asher asalo b'no hakatan. When Noach woke up from the wine, he learned vayeda, he knew literally that which his youngest son had done to him. Asher asalo b'no hakatan. So if it's only seeing, then perhaps the Torah would not have said what he did. I mean, you could still interpret what he did is he didn't cover him up, he ran, he told the others. But in the Talmud, they are leaning towards the possibility that Lirot Erva is used euphemistically, and that something that his youngest son had done is negative. Any number of possibilities, all of which are negative. Some kind of immoral sexual behavior. So that's what he knows. That's the story. He gets drunk. He doesn't make himself drunk on purpose. It sounds like maybe he's experimenting. He plants a vineyard. Maybe he's not fully aware of the impact that wine can have. But in any event, after drinking the wine, he gets uncovered in a tent. Chum, there's Shem, there's Chum, and there's Yefet. It's not clear in terms of the age. When you read Shem and Chum and Yefet in the Torah, sounds like Chum is the second son. Shem, Chum, and Yefet. Sounds like he's son number 2. But over here it says that Noach woke up and knew that which the youngest son had done. It sounds like the youngest here probably means the youngest of the 3, that Chum is actually the youngest. Later on in the Chumash, it's interesting. So you have Shem, Chum, and Yefet, but Chum, it turns out, is not number 2, but son number 3. Shem, Chum, and Yefet, it sounds like Shem is the oldest one, but later on, it talks about Achi Yefet HaGadol. Later on in the Chumash, when it talks about the genealogies, it refers to Yefet as the oldest. So what it sounds like is the birth order is actually Yefet, then Shem, and then Chum. To which the question can be raised, if that be the case, why is it Shem, Chum, and Yefet? It should be Yefet, Shem, and Chum. So Kasuto talks about this, just as a small digression. And what Kasuto points out is that typically in the biblical writings, when you have lists of names, the biblical authors tend to start with a shorter name and move to the longer name. Shem, Chum, and Yefet. He has several examples of this. So Yefet is a bigger word, so it's put at the end. And he has many examples of that. I don't know if it's always the case, but it very often is the case. In any event, that's a side point, but he's called the youngest over here. Chum is the youngest. He did something wrong. Exactly the nature of it is not clear. He tells his 2 brothers. And now in contrast to Chum, back to verse number 23 now, it says, Vayikach shein vayefet et hasimra, vayasimu ashrem shnehem. So they take some kind of a cloth or a blanket, and they place it on against their backs, both their backs. Vayelchu achoranit, they walk in backwards. Vayechasu et ervat avihem, they cover their father's nakedness. Ufnehem achoranit, but they're facing the other way. V'ervat avihem lo ra'u, they did not see their father's nakedness. Here it sounds like seeing means literally seeing, which does suggest that the first seeing may also be seeing. So that's the question. But in any event, whether Chum simply saw or did something else, but it's presented by the Chumash as something very negative and in contrast to the other 2. So the other 2 says, Vayichu Shem vayefet, that Shem and Yefet take the Simra. And here it would appear actually from how Noach responds, that the primary actor is Shem, and that Yefet is Shem's assistant. But they're coming together, carrying the blanket on their backs, the backs of both, backs or shoulders of both, and they cover their father up. And Noach wakes up, and he finds out somehow, we don't know how, he knows that which his youngest son had done to him. He's going to respond. Now, before we get to Noach's response and the significance of this story, I'll stop here for a minute. If anybody has any comments or questions, I'll be happy to hear. Or questions in general about Noach. Now I'll go on. But, yes.
Unfortunately, it takes us back to where you started in the beginning. I just don't I have the translation in front of me, and I don't understand one of Sukkim at all. What you were talking about, where Noach and people in general were given the right to eat animals.
Yes.
And then it says, okay, Ach basar benafsho damo lo tochelu. All right, we don't eat blood. I kind of get that. And then it says, Ve'ach es dimcha lenafsho sechem. This whole pasuk, I don't really understand. Even the
Right.
I don't like the translation here either.
Okay, what it means is that this verse leads up to the next one. What it means is that you're allowed to kill the animals. You're not allowed to take a limb off a living animal. This probably means benafsho damo, but for Abram menachai. And then the Torah says, and I will seek your blood. In other words, if it talks about murder, if you kill somebody, or if an animal kills somebody, also if an animal kills, the animal also will be put to death, which is true later in the Chumash, in the legal sections. And as far as people as well, from one against one's brother, if you kill another person whom the Chumash calls your brother, I will seek out edrosh et nefesh hadam. This verse, and then the next verse says, it talks about the punishment that the human being has the responsibility to set up a system whereby this can't happen. If one commits murder, one gets punished. What's interesting about this
set
verse,
that up with Cain and Hevel?
Yes, so with Cain and Hevel, Cain wasn't warned beforehand. I mean, he was told to behave properly. What's interesting is as you say, the Cain and Hevel story, and the story over here, which is very clear that a life for a life, basically. Torah does believe in capital punishment. The rabbinic tradition limits it extensively, but those two stories of murder, the first killing of Cain killing Hevel, and the story over here, later on figure very prominently in this story of Yosef, when the brothers initially conspire to kill Yosef. And they're going to kill Yosef, and they're going to throw him into a pit. Right? Remember, with Cain killed Hevel, he buries him in the ground to cover it up. So he sort of makes the earth his accomplice. And then, to cover up the crime, they kill an animal and they dip the coat of Joseph in the blood of the animal. So you have over here actually, both in the Cain and Hevel story and the story in chapter 9, verses that are referenced later on. When the brothers killed Joseph, they conspire to make the earth, they throw him into a pit, they're going to kill him in the pit. They conspire to make the earth their sort of accomplice. And then they also make the animals their accomplice, because they kill an animal, take Joseph's coat and dip it in the blood of the animal, and they bring it to their father. And when later on in the Joseph narrative, if you remember, when the brothers come down to Egypt and Joseph accuses them of being spies, Reuven speaks to his brothers, because Reuven was the one who said we shouldn't kill Joseph. And Reuven says to the brothers, I told you not to do it. V'gam damo hinei nidrash. And today his blood is being sought out. And obviously that plays off the verse over here that you cited. V'yachet dimchem unafshotechem edrosh, miyad kol chaya edrishenu. So I will seek out, I'll be doresh. I'll make a demand. The idea of drisha is a demand. Drisha is a very interesting word. It means to study carefully. It means to search. It also means to demand. God makes demands upon us. Freedom comes with responsibility in the Chumash. That's the idea. So those verses, both the Cain and Hevel story that you mentioned, And the verses over here which outlaw murder, and not only if a human being kills, but if the animal kills, and then later on the Chumash, typically we use these two sets of verses when it describes the Joseph story. How very often an act of murder, it's not just the murderer who commits the act, the murderer has all kinds of accomplices. Sometimes they're human accomplices, sometimes they are using the earth or using what's in the earth to allow them to do what they do. And the Torah is very aware of that and is telling us that God will seek out the blood of those who have been murdered,
including animals who murder people.
Yes, later on in the Chumash, if an animal kills a person, the animal is put to death in the Torah.
But not animals who murder animals.
No, they're not put to death. They have to pay, right? Right.
I think we have one more comment or question from David.
Yes. Oh.
David, go ahead.
Oh, I have to change the label. It's Alan Septimus.
What is it, Alan? I can change it. Is your name Alan?
Alan.
It's Alan.
Alan.
Okay.
What? It's a difficult question, but the issue of interpreting what's going on with Noah and his sons. What is the purpose, do you feel, about this sort of deliberate ambiguity, which appears, quite often in the Tanakh? What purpose does it serve? To just allow us to interpret it any which way, or
I mean, in terms of what he actually did? It's a good question. I don't know. I really don't know the answer. I think it is very unclear what. Well, it could mean just to see, because the alternative is they don't see.
I'm asking a different question. What is
another question?
Yeah. Okay.
What is the idea in this case, but in more generally speaking, of purposeful ambiguity? Part of it, I think, is I'm not talking this specific case over here. That's a good question, but in general, when you leave open different possibilities, what I claim is that leaving over two possibilities allows each possibility to be used later on in connecting to other texts. So what it really does is when you read one text, you're reading not just one text, you're reading one text and all the others that have a literary connection to it. But on top of that, the text that has a literary connection to it itself is very nuanced and very complex. So when you get to a string of, say, 3 or 4 texts, when you're reading the fourth text, you're hearing a lot of different voices, and it makes all kinds of possibilities. And there still is, as I say, there's probably a main line, but there's all kinds of other nuances. And what it does, I think, it allows the reader to focus on, the particular story in a much more sophisticated and much more complex way. Adds complexity. One of the problems I always had, even as a kid, about reading the Chumash as Yaakov is a tzaddik, Esav is a rasha, that kind of thinking, among other things, apart from the fact I think it's a misreading of the text, I think it's a desecration of the text in a certain way. It's a strong word, but the text is much greater than that. These are not little Bible stories. The characters are very complex, and I think the purposeful ambiguity lends itself to seeing these texts in a much more complex way, in a much more real way. That's as a general statement. Over here, I don't know about the different possibilities. Did he actually do something, or did he just see? Or maybe the Chumash is saying something else, which is sometimes just seeing is like doing. We always distinguish between, I didn't really say anything or whatever, but sometimes in our lives, even if you don't say anything, it has the same impact on the other person as if you did say something. Sometimes the very mode of behavior, without saying a word, can actually, depending on the context, can carry very severe consequences for the guy on the other side. So maybe that's another possibility. But the question is a very good one in terms of general, but also in terms of this particular case. So I'd have to think it through some more. I haven't, but
Rabbi Silber, I have a suggestion, possibly.
Yes.
In Achrei Mot, when it introduces the list of impermissible sexual relations, It starts by saying, Kamasei Eretz Mitzrayim asher yishavtem balo tasu, ukamasei Eretz Canaan asher ani mevi'etchem shama lo tasu.
Yes.
So maybe, saying that there's sexual immorality in Canaan and you're connecting it to Cham Zavi Canaan, that maybe that's part of saying that what Cham did was something sexually immoral with his father.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think that's clear that the mention of Canaan over here is not that necessarily Canaan did this particular thing, but that what the Chumash is saying is that Cham is Avi Canaan, and the way Cham acted over here is the way the Canaanites act generally. I think that's 100% correct. I have no question about that. But again, it wouldn't explain necessarily why the ambiguity about what did he do. Was it a sexual act? Did he harm his father? Did he just look? Those are all possibilities. But your larger point, I think, is clear. The mention of Canaan, the Cham Avi Canaan, is not that Canaan did something. There's someone who want to argue that Canaan actually does something in this story. I don't see that personally, that Canaan did something in the story. But I do think that your point is well taken, that the behavior of Cham, says the Chumash, is the way the Canaanites act, generally speaking. And we have a story in Bereishit of the story of Dinah. But later on, as you point out, in Vayikra, Kamasei Eretz Canaan, Lo Tasu. Ukamasei Eretz Canaan, Mitzrayim, Lo Tasu. Mitzrayim and Canaan. And I would just add, for those that don't know this, that when you read the book of Genesis, which is essentially a bunch of stories, but every so often there are genealogies, there are a bunch of names. Right. We tend sometimes to skip the names. And many years ago, I said, maybe the book of Bereishit is a bunch of names interrupted by stories. But here's one genealogy that's very important. Cham has 4 sons, the youngest of which is Canaan, but one of his brothers is named Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim and Canaan are brothers. And that is a point of great significance in the Chumash. And maybe I'm only giving, I think, this class once or twice, but that is significant in Sefer Bereishit and beyond, obviously, in the verse you cited. Kamasei Eretz Canaan Lo Tasu, Kamasei Eretz Mitzrayim. That's clear. So that's an important point.
Right. I mean, Rashi says,
yes.
Okay, no, Rashi says, Magid Shemaseim Shel Mitzrayim Shel Canaanim Mukukalim Mikol Ha'umot. Yotomakom Sheyeshvu Bo Yisrael Mukukol Min Hakol. And then it says, Magid She'otan Amamin Shekavshu Yisrael Mukukolim Yoter Mikulam. So.
Right. Okay, that's true. That's Rashi. Typically, that's Rashi's approach. But certainly, Mitzrayim Canaan connection is clear. That's for sure. Mitzrayim is the place that if you go there, you have no control over them. Basically, they're going to rip you off, and you can't do anything about it. And Canaan is the place where, theoretically speaking, you're more secure, where there God is present. God can help you as long as you behave yourself. God can help you, etc. But there are brothers, no doubt about it. All right, let's just finish this little chapter here, and then I'm going to get to
David?
a couple of. Yes.
I've been having technical difficulties, so I've been in and out. Maybe you said this, but when the brothers come down to Mitzrayim, Yosef accuses them. Vatem l'rotet ervat haaretz.
I didn't mention that, but that is a very important point, right? L'rotet ervat haaretz batem, and the question is, what does that mean? That is a very important point. I mean, I do believe, without getting into the specifics of it, I do believe that there are, and we know this is the case, there are many references in the Joseph narrative in general to the story of Dinah. Dinah and Yosef are connected in many ways, so it could be that there's a reference to that. In other words, the story of Dinah, they come down under the guise of, actually the guise is let's do business together, right? And that's what, as our tischaru, under the guise of doing business, they come down using that as a front, and then they end up destroying Shem. So, Lerotet Erat Aretz Batem could be a way, perhaps, of saying, well, you seem to come down as a bunch of people who want food, but actually you have something else in mind. And maybe the reference to Dinah is a suggestion of potential violence or whatever. So that's one possibility. There it comes in connection with being Meraglim. So you're coming on you have a secret mission or whatever it is. I mentioned something else about the Joseph story, but not that. So thanks for that point. what the larger point being, these stories in the beginning of Bereishit are constantly being referenced later. That's the way the Chumash works. So it builds upon all these stories in all kinds of interesting ways. In any event, Noach wakes up in verse number 24. Vayiketz Noach miyena. He knows what the youngest son has done. Now we have a couple of verses. Vayomer Orur Canaan. That's why cursed is Canaan. Eved Avodim Yeliachav. Canaan shall be a slave to his brethren. So he curses Canaan. Vayomer Baruch Hashem Elohei Shem. Blessed is the God of Shem. V'hi Canaan Eved Lamo, and Canaan shall be his slave. Yafne Elohim Liyefet, v'yishkon b'yolei Shem. Yaf probably means to enlarge. That's the translation here. God should enlarge Yefet, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem. And Canaan shall be V'hi Canaan Eved Lamo, and let Canaan be a slave. Here they translate to them. Literally, Lamo is him. But maybe Canaan is also a slave indirectly to Yefet as well. That's the story. And then Noach's death is recorded. He lives another 350 years and he dies. So another question is, what do we make of these three verses over here, 25, 26, and 27? And there's a lot to be said about this. I wanted to make one point. I mentioned this in the past, many years ago. And the point, I think, is the following. Let's begin with, why does Noach become drunk? So I suggested, it could be, happens by accident. It could be that, he's just experimenting. He plants this vineyard. He doesn't really know what happens. I mean, that presumes that he didn't taste the wine first. Because if you taste the wine, you feel a little woozy, presumably you wouldn't keep drinking it. One possibility is he doesn't know. But the other possibility is that actually the becoming drunk is not really an accident, but that in some sense, becoming drunk is he doesn't take precautions not to become drunk. He might even welcome it. And if one reads it that way, why would he welcome it? So I think if we think about this, what happens to Noach? There's drunkenness and there's some kind of immoral sexual act that takes place. And in thinking about the story of Noach here in chapter 9, what comes to mind immediately is the story of Lot in chapter 19. The story of Lot in chapter 19, we have exactly these two phenomena. We have at the end of chapter 19, after Lot escapes from Sodom with his two daughters, the two daughters he had wanted to give away to the people of Sodom to protect his two guests. But at the end of the day, the angels who come to Sodom to destroy Sodom save Lot. They drag him out, even though he tarries. He takes his two daughters with him. They end up in a cave. And one daughter says to the other at the end of chapter 19, there's no one alive. Our world has been destroyed. There's no more world. Let's sleep with our father and produce children. So the world will have children and the world can continue. And that's what happens. Each one sleeps with their father. The older one sleeps with the father the first night, and the younger one then follows suit. Each one has a child. The name of the older one is called Moav, Me'av, from father. And the second one is called Ben Ami, Ammon. Those are the two nations that are born from Lot and Lot's daughters. And if you think about the story of Lot and the story of Noach, they're very similar stories. These are two people who lived through a great destruction. In the case of Lot, all the cities in the plain have been destroyed. The world, one might say, the world of Lot's daughters has been destroyed. And the daughters are responding to that, and their response is to try to produce life. Generally speaking, many of the commentaries are sort of see them in a favorable light, even though it's incest, father-daughter incest, the ultimate incest. However, their goal is to produce life. So it reminds us very much of what we call levirate marriage. That's when a man dies without children and he has a brother. So in the Chumash, anyway, the brother is commanded to marry the wife and to produce an heir who will be called on his brother's name. So that's a brother-in-law. So a brother-in-law is on the list of forbidden relationships. It's actually considered incest. So it's an incestuous relationship which the Torah permits under those circumstances. So in the story of Lot, one can read this similarly in terms of the daughters. Their intention was to repopulate the world. The world has been destroyed. That's as far as they are concerned. But as far as, so in the case of Noah, obviously, we have the destruction of the world. We've seen everything that's been destroyed. So the response to seeing this terrible destruction in the Chumash, in both instances, is first of all becoming drunk. And then there's the loosening of all moral bounds. When there's war, always, and the Torah warns about this, there's always a loosening of morality. War is the right to kill. So when there's a war, the Torah is very concerned that when we fight wars, that we take certain internal precautions about safeguarding our own set of values. In any event, the response both of Lot and Noah then is parallel. In each case, there's some kind of sexual act, which typically speaking is considered wrong. And there's also the getting drunk, sort of dropping out. Because after the terrible catastrophe, it's hard to function in the world. And here we have a very important distinction between Lot and Noah, critical distinction. When you read the two stories together, there are two critical distinctions between them. The first one is to be found in our chapter 9, verse number 24. Vayiketz Noach miyeno. Noah awoke from his wine. Vayeda et asher asalo b'no hakatan, and he knew, somehow he knows, he knew what the youngest son had done to him. That's our story here in Noah, Parashat Noah. When you look ahead at chapter 19, after they leave, they run away from Sodom, or shepherded out of Sodom, and we're told they go into a cave, and Lot has two daughters, and then we're told in chapter 19, in verse number 31, our father is old, and there's no man to cohabit with us. Let's give our father wine to drink, sleep with him, and maintain life through our father. So they do this. They give their father to drink. She sleeps with her father. And then the Torah says, he did not know when she lay down and when she arose. That's the first night. The next day, the same thing happens. The older one says to the younger one, I gave my father to drink last night. Tonight, you give him to drink. And you sleep with him tonight. And that's what happens in verse number 35. Again, he did not know in her lying down or her rising up. The two daughters become pregnant and they each have a child. One is Moab and the other is Ammon. So the contrast then between the story in chapter 19 and the story over here in chapter 9 is, first of all, in the case of Noah, when he wakes up, says the Torah, Vayeda, he knows what has happened. And because he knows what's happened, he springs into action. I'll get to that in a minute. But in the case of Lot, he does not know. And here, I just wanted, as an aside, to point out something else. Then I'll get to the last point, which is, I think, the critical point. The story of Lot and his daughters, one might say, is a kind of, I mentioned levirate marriage. It's a kind of levirate marriage. It's a, because what is levirate marriage? Levirate marriage is a forbidden relationship, incest, which is permissible under certain circumstances to keep someone alive. The idea of levirate marriage is you keep your brother alive through levirate marriage. And Lot's daughters, they make it clear, they say it explicitly. It's a kind of levirate marriage. But because levirate marriage is fundamentally incest, the critical point in the Torah is that the people that engage in this act have to do so with the understanding that what and the purpose of what they are doing. So the point is that the situation of Lot and his daughters, one might say hypothetically, if Lot had consented to this, then perhaps the Torah would have had a very different view of it. Perhaps it would be seen as a legitimate act. But since Lot never knows, he never wakes up, one might say, from what happened, he never has the opportunity to validate what has transpired. Then it becomes a simply kind of immoral act. It's incest. It's nothing more than that. Because in order to sanctify it, in a sense, both parties have to be aware of what they're doing. And the contrast to the story of Lot, of course, is a different story in the book of Genesis, which I have always claimed is, from the plot standpoint, the most important story in Genesis. And that's the story in chapter 38 of Judah and Tamar. Because the story of Judah and Tamar is that Judah has lost 2 sons, Tamar has lost 2 husbands, and it's the 3rd son lurking in the background whom Judah refuses to hand over. He's afraid that his son will die. Okay, but if you don't hand the son over, then the first 2 sons can extend their kin lines. And Tamar understands this, and without getting into all the specifics of the story, she dresses up as a prostitute, stands in the road. Yehuda interested in her, and ends up sleeping with her, and she ends up having twins. Now, when he first meets her, if you remember in chapter 38, the Torah says she disguised herself. She veiled her face in chapter 38. And Judah said, let me come to you. And the Chumash says, Ki lo yada ki tohi. He did not know she was his daughter-in-law. So it makes it very clear that the sleeping with Tamar is an act of unknowing. In fact, he sleeps with a woman whose face is covered, which is a profane act, I would say, from his perspective. She knows exactly who he is, but he says the Torah does not know. He has no idea. He tries to find her afterwards. They can't find her. He has no idea. Later in the story, he discovers she's pregnant. He says, take her out and let her burn. But she was betrothed to my son. So it's like a married woman who had an affair. I mean, hypocrisy has no ends. But the point is, she's being let out to be killed. She sends to Judah the symbols he had given her, the things he had given her as payment to the prostitute. And she says, do you recognize these things? The possessor of these things is the father of these potential children. So then Judah recognized them. Tzadka mimeni, she's more righteous than I. And then the Torah says, V'lo yosaf od lidata. He knew her not again. And that's a very interesting statement. He knew her not again. He knew her not again suggests he once did know her. But the Chumash said explicitly he didn't know her. So how do we reconcile those 2 statements? The Torah made it clear in spades. He doesn't know who she is. Then afterwards, he says he didn't know her anymore. He didn't know her in the first place. So in that story, the point of the story, I have claimed, is that by virtue of his confession, he retroactively validates the past. It's as if he didn't know her. It's as if there were consent through the confession. So there is yediyah. And because there's yediyah, it becomes a sacred act. From her perspective, it was a sacred act. But the wearing of her veil, by the way, has 2 meanings. One is concealment from him, but the wearing of a veil in the book of Genesis is what a woman who's getting married puts on. When Rebecca sees Isaac, she veils herself. From her perspective, it's a sacred act. From his perspective, it's a prostitute. But through confession, you can retroactively change the past, and it becomes an act of knowing. And those 2 kids that are born are Judah's children, included in the family. They're part of Judah's family. So the point is here, in the case of Noah, he knows. But in the case of Lot, he does not know. And because he knows, okay, his knowing then becomes extremely significant, not in terms, not levirate marriage over here, but his knowing becomes significant for a different reason. In the other instance, the knowing can sanctify the past. In the case of Lot, he never knows, so it remains an immoral act. What about the knowing over here in our story? So here, the point I wanted to make about the knowing is the following, and then I'll stop and take comments and questions. What does his knowing, suggest in the text? So what he says is next. What he does, what is curse and to bless. Orur Canaan, he curses Canaan, shall be a slave, and Baruch Hashem Elohei Shem and Shem, blessed is Shem. Canaan shall be in servitude to Shem. I had two comments to make about this, then I'll stop and take comments, questions. First of all, blessing and cursing is the way God has governed the world. You open up the Chumash, beginning of Bereishit, God blesses the fish, God blesses the birds, God blesses the human being, right? God bless them. So God blesses God's creations. And then the end of it, the culminating text in the first creation narrative is that God completed the work in 6 days and rested on the seventh, right? And the Torah says, read that verse. It says, Vayivarech Elohim et Yom HaShvi vayikadesh oto. God blessed the seventh day. God sanctified it. Ki lo shavat mikol melachto asher bara Elohim la'asot. So the first creation narrative ends with blessing. That's what God does. First creation narrative, everything is good, and collectively it's very good. And we end with the capstone of creation is the Sabbath, which is blessed day. That's how God creates the world with blessings. But then things begin to go wrong. In the second creation narrative, it's a very different story. And that ends up with, among other things, curses. So first of all, after the human being partakes of the forbidden fruit, God says to Adam, let's find the verse, the earth shall be cursed on your account. You will eat it. You will eat it in with toil, with difficulty, all the days of your life. So not that Adam is cursed, but the earth is cursed on account of Adam. And when it comes to the snake, God says to the snake, so the snake is actually cursed. So there's evil in the world, and that evil has to be called out and it's cursed. But suddenly the God of blessings in the first Genesis narrative is the God who curses in the second narrative. And the next story, Cain and Hevel, after Cain kills Hevel, and as mentioned before, buries him in the ground. So the ground becomes a accomplice to the crime. God says, "V'ata avur ata, you are cursed. Mina adama asher patzta pia, from the earth, or more than the earth, it's not clear, which opens its mouth to take your brother's blood. The earth will not produce for you, not yield its strength to you anymore." So there we have another curse. So in other words, what God is doing basically is blessing and cursing. That's the way God governs the world. But when Noah emerges from the ark, God is not blessing and cursing the world anymore. But God turns the governance of the world over to Noah. And when Noah wakes up from his drunkenness, he wakes up and assumes the responsibility. One might argue that the reason that Noah gets drunk in the first place, I suggested earlier, because he's the witness to terrible destruction. That's one possibility. But another possibility is that, which doesn't contradict the first, is that not just about witnessing the horrors of destruction, it's also about the recognition that I am responsible for this world. The burden of responsibility is one that sometimes is very hard to accept. Responsibility involves doing all kinds of very difficult things, and sometimes would seem not only difficult, but near impossible. And from the weight of that, one can also sort of opt out. So those are two different life possibilities. But now he wakes up and he determines that he's going to make moral judgments. I think I'll tell you a story. Many years ago, on the west side of Manhattan, I was invited to speak at something called the Warehouse. I don't know if it still exists, how long it existed. So they invited me to speak, and I spoke there. I actually spoke about this story of Lot. And then there was a woman who met me in one of the stores. It was Fairway, a grocery store there. And she said, I was at your warehouse lecture. I'm going to start coming to study with you. I want to learn. Her name was Elga Stolman, of blessed memory. A great person, actually. She got very involved in Drisha, put a lot of people to learn. She died, unfortunately. She was 70 years old. She was a very young person when she died. She was 70, but she was so useful. And I remember I paid a shiva call. And her husband said to me, wait, I want to show you something. And he brought out from his house a picture frame. And the picture frame said, on this day, there'll be a warehouse. And the picture frame, and different speakers, David Silber, and she had circled my name. He said that this class changed her life, he said, changed her life. She became a different person. She became totally into learning. I mean, it's very true, actually. I know it was only the class, but it certainly was that way. And what struck her about the class was this, that she was a survivor, or the child of a survivor. And what I'd spoken about was calling out evil on one hand, but also not despairing of the world on the other. There is real evil in the world. There's evil, and it's got to be called out. It's got to be confronted, and we try to eradicate it. On the other hand, the idea that the world is only evil, which is what some victims can feel, that's something we have to be very careful about. And that's the story of Noah, actually, who lived with evil, a kind of irredeemable evil. Everything was destroyed. And when Noah emerges from the ark, he just opts out. But then when he wakes up, he says to himself, evil has to be confronted and destroyed, not excused. On the other hand, there are points of light in the world. Not everybody is bad. And we have to be very, very careful to maintain our own moral sensibilities and to be able to distinguish one thing from the other and to understand that not only text and nuance, but the world is a very nuanced place. So that is the point over here that's why she saved that particular, she changed her life actually. And it actually did change her life. And that's what Noah is saying over here. So he's saying that he's going to affirm blessedness. At the same time, he calls out evil. And he's saying something else, which is that in a world in which God has said, I'm not going to be intimately involved in every aspect of the world. In a world that very often, I'll speak for myself, we don't see very much of God altogether. I say this, my personal view. Then I think it behooves us to see ourselves as taking that role and trying to think what would the right way to act be in this kind of situation. And that's what Noah is doing. He's stepping into God's shoes. Up to now, God is blessed and cursed. And what Noah is saying is, from this point on, I'm the one. You said to me, govern the world. Sheva mitzvah b'nei Noach. You said I'm responsible for the world. So the first thing I have to understand is to be able to distinguish clearly, even in the face of terrible evil, to be able to call out evil, at the same time, not to despair of the world. That's a challenge I think we often face. I think many of us face it right now. You're confronted with real evil. But the danger is thinking everybody's evil. There is real evil, which has to be rooted out and destroyed, but not everybody is evil. So the idea of blessing and cursing at this particular time carries with it a great significance. And this is the world in which Noah lives is not the world of Kito. It's not the world of chapter 1 of Genesis. Everything is good. Everything's very good. Not at all. God said it when Noah emerged from the ark and God smelled Noah's sacrifice. Yetzalev ha'adam rami no rav. Says God, there's a lot of evil in the world, and therefore my expectations have been lowered in terms of what people do and people can do. At the same time, says God, I turn it over to the human being to make those kind of decisions. And I'll stop at this point. So if anybody has any comments or questions, I'd be happy to hear. have a couple of minutes. If not, we'll just, yes. Yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Rabbi Silber.
No, I'm saying, I said what I wanted to say about the Parsha, and
Okay.
these Parshios are very rich. There's so much more to say. I focused on a particular piece of the Parsha, which I tried to speak about something, given the circumstances that we're living in, to at least put forth what I believe is the Pshat in Chumash, and I think is also the Pshat in life. I think I feel it's an important idea, which is in the Parashah, and I think we have to bear that in mind.
I think we're all wishing that the people who are conflating an arguably just Palestinian cause with what Hamas is doing is a big issue. You can, to think that the kind of atrocities that Hamas committed is equivalent to, wanting better conditions for Palestinians is exactly what you're talking about. Not being able to distinguish between real evil and, difficult issues in the world that need attention.
Right, without getting to this, I agree. Without getting to the specifics of this whole Palestinian issue, which is very, very complicated, because you very often in life, situation in life is that very often it's not a choice between good and evil. Very often in life, most of the times, I think, it's a choice between two things, neither of which is really perfect. We live in an imperfect world, and you have to figure out, given the options that are there for you, all of which have their problems, what is the best path forward? And I think that's, in terms of the situation with Israel and Palestinians and all of that business, which is very complicated, I think that it's not about there's one clear right path or wrong path. There's look, I have my own view of this stuff, and I think Israel could do better in terms of the Palestinians. At the same token, it's not so simple. It's very complicated. I'm going to get into this now, but in order, I think, to work something out, you need two people of good faith working together. I don't think Israel has a partner right now, or has had a partner for a long time. But I agree with you totally that we have to be able to, one of my teachers, my first Rabbi was Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. From where I learned a lot. One of the many good things about him is, first of all, he looked at the world from a completely moral standpoint. His question was not political, it was always what's the right thing to do. But the other point of it was that he insisted on a kind of nuance. It's never so simple. You always have to understand all sides of something. That's not to say that the other side is that you're wrong. You could be 100% right. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of that, to understand the other position is very important. And that's how we taught. The Talmud is filled with disputes from beginning to end. And his point was, whatever you decide at the end to go with, you always have to understand the other side. So the idea of nuance was to him very, very central, to think about it deeply, not with slogans. You know what I mean? And we have it all the time. Right to life, women's right to life versus choice versus life. I mean, that's a nonsensical statement, because 99% of the people believe in people having choices. They also believe in people's right to life. They believe in both. That's not the issue. These are slogans. The abortion is a very complicated issue. There's 100 pieces to it. What's really dangerous is when you fall into slogans, whether it's in our own communities or on university campuses, because that is always a bad thing. It always leads to extremism, and it leads to not hearing the other guy. And that's a great danger, I think, that we face. So part of my teaching profession has been study of Chumash, what Alan mentioned before, is to understand these texts are complicated. And very often, they have many different messages simultaneously. There are some just bad, there is evil. The Chumash does not deny there's evil. There's evil. Amalek is evil, clearly. But for the main characters of the Chumash, the real characters they care about, they're never fully righteous or evil. They're always very complex. They're very, very human. And I think that approach to life, by the same token, to call evil out, but the same token to recognize that in most of our decisions, it's not really black and white. They're very complicated situations, and you try to do the best you can do. And very often you're choosing between two bad alternatives. I try to think about that all the time. And even when one is outraged by behavior, I think that's when we really have to be careful to maintain our best moral self. Okay, I'll stop at this point then. So, Sarot Tovot, Yeshivot V'nechamot. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Really love having everyone part of our learning community. Just remember that the full Zman courses continue today. Just in about less than a half an hour, we have a class with Rabbi Zachary Truboff on Frank Rosenweig. That's at 2 p.m. Eastern. And also to learn more with Rabbi Silber, you can sign up for Mishnah in Depth, Masechet Yevamot, starting this Sunday, October 15th.
Let me introduce and interrupt for 1 second, those that are still there. We have a new project of Mishnah Yomi, that is people taking on the study of Mishnah, which I highly encourage. It's really a pathway to Torah Shabbat Peh, and we will help with that. There'll be a weekly shiur. Is an order of Mishnayot, about 2 Mishnayot a day, 14 a week, and we're going every week to give a class. I'm doing the first track, the Yevamot. It's not simple, but the point is to be able to pace people along and to encourage everybody. It's mostly learning on your own. It can be done in English and Hebrew. It can be done at your own time. Maybe it's 20 minutes a day, whatever. But it's something that I think at the end of if you commit to it and you can complete it, if you complete a whole Seder, first when we're doing a Seder Nashim, I think it sort of gives you much more of a broader scope in terms of the Torah Shabbat Peh, the ongoing interpretive tradition that we have. So I encourage everybody, it starts on the 24th, Tuesday, Yevamot, but this Sunday, I'm going to teach at 1 o'clock as an introduction. So I encourage you and all your friends to join, if you can. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is this Sunday, October 15 at 1 p.m. And we always have many classes scheduled. We have classes scheduled right now for full Zman. As I said, you can visit our website at 5784.drisha.org/fall and hope to see you soon.